The American Adoption Conference, 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D, 151, number 42.
Probably should get started because this is a very full day, and we have an hour and a half for this presentation, and it's going to be my Evelyn Wood speed reading course on adoption issues, because it's very hard to fit all of this into such a short time. I also want to be sure to leave plenty of time for questions and comments from everyone, and in order to do that, I'm going to speak very fast. I'm talking about the family systems approach to working with adoption, especially looking at children's best interest, in whose best interest is all of this. And in order to do that, I like to present my framework for looking at adoption, and I like to say a little bit in the beginning about the biases that I have. I'm adopted. I was adopted at 10 days, and I think that that certainly affects my approach and the way that I work, so it's important that you know that. I also have made it my work professionally and politically, as well as personally, over the past 20 years to work for adoption reform. I have two clinics that I started in the Massachusetts area, one that works with family therapy and adoption. We do a lot of training of professionals, and we see families, birth families, adoptive families, and professionals in consultation and supervision around adoption issues. And then there's another clinic that I have as well that deals with adoption issues and resources in the community. And the work that I've done in the past includes some research that was done at Harvard, and I like to talk about the title of that research because it's a nice way to frame what I'm going to be talking about today. The title of it is The Normative Crises in the Development of the Adoptive Family. And it's an interesting title because people don't often think of crises as normative. And yet there are certain things that happen in the lifespan of people involved in adoption that are very normal. We learn as time goes on, and we see many adoptees, many birth parents, many adoptive parents. The other thing about the title that I think is important is when I say the adoptive family, I'm including the birth family. Because from a systemic point of view, thinking of things in terms of family systems, just as when a couple marries, your in-laws are with you in your marriage, whether they live next door or 3,000 miles away. They're there like a Greek chorus. And when you adopt a child, you're adopting the birth family along with that child, whether it's a closed adoption or an open adoption, whether you know very little or you know very much. It is really a part of the family. And I think that unless we look at it that way, we're not really serving everyone in the way that's best. And so what I'd like to do is to give you just a quick view of some of the normal crises, some of the things that we've seen in the clinic over the years to frame. And what I'm doing, first of all, is to talk a little bit about birth parents and a little bit about adoptive parents, because when you're working with an adopted child, you can't not think about the rest of the family. People don't grow in a vacuum. And the effect that the birth parents and the adoptive parents have on this child are very, very important, and they can't be ignored. So I like to talk about the most normal situations, and then we can extrapolate. I mean, in the simplest cases, and there's nothing about adoption that's simple, so the simplest cases are not very simple. But there are certainly much more complex ones when we're dealing with international adoptions, biracial adoptions, older child adoptions, handicapped adoptions. Things become more and more complex. But even in the case of an infant adoption, there are issues, there are concerns, and they continue throughout the life cycle. And it's important that we have an awareness about that. Some of the things that I think are important to look at is how we deal with birth parents. And in our clinic, we've developed some ways of looking at the issues of the birth parents right from the beginning. I like to tell stories, and I think that the best way to highlight some of these is by sharing some of the stories that I've experienced over the years in my work. The first story is of a birth mother that I worked with who was 17 when she came into the clinic, and she was 8 months pregnant at the time, and she had been sent by her obstetrician. And this was a young woman who was very ambivalent about what she should do in terms of this pregnancy. She had clearly decided to have the pregnancy. She was 7 months pregnant. And what her choices were whether she would be a single parent at 17 or whether she was to render her child for adoption. And she knew very little about either of those. She was 17 years old. What we try to do, and I think that one of the things about the clinic that I founded is that it's free-floating. It has nothing to do with the business of adoption. And I think that it's interesting that most of the counseling that's available in this country around adoption is centered around adoption agencies. And many of the people who are most knowledgeable and who really are very progressed in this are people who are working with agencies. And yet I think it's very difficult for all of the people involved to receive the kind of help that feels very objective. For a birth mother to go to an adoption agency to talk about whether or not to surrender is sort of a funny thing, because the agency's business is to place babies. And certainly there are people who are very good at giving clear counseling, but just the fact that you're in an adoption agency is a bit intimidating for the young people who are involved in this process. And so what we've done is to create a place where people can come that has nothing to do with that really is a place where people can be educated and can think about these issues in a clear way. This young woman had an interesting and difficult life history. She had been brought up in an alcoholic family, and she had been abused as a child. And so she had no support from her family. And in most cases, we do bring in the whole family and try to get the family involved in the process. Because if, what is needed for a 17-year-old in order to think about whether or not she can be a single parent is a lot of support. And it would take a lot of support from the extended family or from other people if she were going to be able to do this. In this case, that wasn't an option. And so she thought about all of the other options that she would have. I also believe that it's very difficult, especially for an adolescent, to make a decision using abstract reasoning when that is a new acquisition for an adolescent, something they're just beginning to be able to do. And so to think about what it will be like to be a parent at any age is sort of a hard thing to do, but especially for an adolescent is very difficult. And to make a decision prior to the birth of that baby is very, very difficult. So one of the things that we've done is we work very closely with the birth family of the birth mother, her family, or with a foster family or a place that she is staying. And we work really closely to have these people understand that it's very important for this young person, this young couple, if the birth father is involved, to begin to make a decision, a conscious decision based on reality. And so what we did with this young woman was to place her in a foster home. We have some foster families that are willing to take adolescents and their babies and to be there as overseers. We do not want these foster parents to take care of the infant. The point is for this young woman and this young man, if the birth father is there, to be very clear about what the day-to-day, moment-to-moment process is, and to make a conscious decision about whether that is at all possible. In this particular case, this young woman did stay in this home for 3 months with her baby. She was very bonded to her son, and yet she was very clear that she was not going to be able to take care of him and to take care of herself. And so she did choose to surrender him for adoption. And it was a very, very painful decision for her to make. And yet her biggest fear was that if she wasn't able to handle it, he would go back to her parents, or that they would be involved in his life, and that was just too much for her. And so she did choose to surrender. And what she wasn't aware of, people who are in this process need a lot of education. She didn't know that there was such a thing as open adoption. She didn't know that there were the possibilities to meet the prospective adoptive parents. And so that was all explained to her. And it was very important for her. And when you think about it, to me, openness is extremely important. And at least at that level, at least at a meeting level, what parent would leave their child with a babysitter or a daycare center without checking it out first? What mother would leave her child with a family for life without knowing something about that family? How unfair it is not to have these young people have some idea of where the child is going. And so that really is something that we have felt is extremely important and have done a lot of education about in terms of helping people to understand the importance. And it's very important for the adoptive family and for the child, and I'll get to that later on, because that information shows a lot of care, shows a lot of love, and really is important information for the family to have. This meeting between these particular adoptive parents and this girl were wonderful. The meeting was very moving, and they were able to see each other and to make some kind of connection that will be in the best interest of that child, certainly, as he grows. Another thing about this that's very important is that the agreement was, this was not an open adoption, but there was some openness to it, and there was the opportunity to keep information through the agency coming between the families. And that's very little, but it certainly is a creeping progression in the way things have been in the past. And that's very, very important, because this young woman was very, very upset. About 2 years after the surrender, she called suicidal in the middle of the night to say that she had a dream that her baby had died and she felt she had killed him. What was happening was she was dealing with her feelings of loss at that point in time, and in fact we were able to call the agency and to get in touch with the adoptive parents, and it really saved her life to know that he was fine, that everything was okay, and that a picture could be sent, and that she could know that everything was all right. I think that it's very callous not to think that people would want to know that everything is all right, and it is in everyone's best interest to have that information shared. I'm going to just switch quickly to another story about birth parents, just to give a spectrum of the lifelong issues in adoption. I had an occasion last year to meet a very wonderful family. A woman called me up in great distress because her father, who was 84 years old, was having a very difficult time, wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating, and she was very concerned about him. 3 days prior to calling me, they had received a phone call. She had picked up the extension and overheard the conversation. On the other end of the line, a young woman asked for Rose, and Sam, the 84-year-old, said, "I'm sorry, that's my wife, and she's been deceased for 4 years." And the person on the other end of the line said, "Well, she was my grandmother, and I wanted to meet her." And he said, "Excuse me, what are you talking about?" And the young woman at the other end of the line said, "She gave my mother up for adoption 48 years ago, and I'm her granddaughter, and I'm searching." And he asked questions, and she knew the answers, and he researched it with her, and he was trying to make sense of it. And he hung up the phone, and his daughter and he just looked at each other, and he was completely distraught. He called a family member. Now, the interesting thing about Sam is that he's 84 years old. All of his siblings and his mother are still alive, and he works full time. He's the most incredible man I've ever met. So he's just amazing. So anyway, he called a brother-in-law who had known his wife before he knew her. And he asked this guy, if the story could be true. And he said, "Oh, absolutely. She went off to New York to have that baby. I remember it well." And so there was confirmation of the information, and he was more depressed. So his daughter brought him in to see me, and they both stayed in the session for the first time, and then I saw him individually for several sessions. And he kept trying to make sense of it, and he was very angry. He felt as if his life had been a lie, as if his wife had kept this from him for all those years, and that he didn't really know her, and who had he been married to. And so he needed a lot of education. We really did a lot of talking about how adoption was 48 years ago, how she was told never to tell anyone, how she was being a good girl by never telling anyone. And he said, "But I was her husband. Why couldn't she have told me?" And I said, "Well, would you have stayed with her if you had known that about her in the beginning? Maybe she was afraid of losing you." And he said, "I don't know." And then he said, "But she was with another man." And so I said, "Well, Sam, did you ever, were you ever with anyone else before you met your wife?" And he said, "You can't ask those questions." And I said, "Yes, I can, because, I'm a shrink. It's okay." So Sam said, "Well, yes, I was." And I said, "And did you think you were disloyal to your wife?" And he said, "No, that was before I knew her." And I said, "Well, I think the same goes for her. And I think we're talking about something that happened way before she met you." I said, "Was she ever disloyal to you after you were together?" And he said, "No, never, never. My Rose would never do that." So slowly he began to understand why someone might keep that secret. And as he began to understand it, he got sadder and sadder. He brought in family albums and showed me pictures of her and said, "Does she look happy in this picture? Does she look okay?" And he started understanding why, after each of their 3 children were born, she was very, very sad and very depressed. And he said, "I thought it was those postpartum blues things." He said, "But now I think it was because she lost one baby, and every time she had another one, she felt sad." He said, "Now I think I understand. And if I had only known, maybe I could have helped her." And so he began to get very sad. He began to cry. He began to understand the feelings that she might have had. We spent a long time, and Sam began to feel better. He began to sleep. He began to feel much better. And he said, when am I done with this therapy stuff? And I said, anytime you want to be done, Sam. I've developed what I call brief long-term therapy. And I see people during certain periods of time, and then they come back, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's a really nice way to work. It normalizes a lot of this. And so I told Sam he could come back for a 50,000-mile checkup. And that, and he said, but wait, before I leave, there's one thing that I want to do. He had a great phrase. He said that his wife, Rose, should have known that the grave spews up secrets. And she should have known that these secrets would come out. And he said, you can't die without having these things taken care of. And he said, Rose didn't finish something, and I want to finish it for her. I want to meet those people for her. And he said, but I don't want them to come to my house, and I don't want to go to their house. Can we meet here? And I said, sure. So we arranged a meeting, and the adoptee and her husband and her 2 children and her grandchild came in, and Sam and his daughter and son-in-law came in. And it was a very moving meeting. Sam brought some photographs to give to the adoptee, and you know, it was amazing. I walked in the door and I had seen all the photographs of Rose already, and when I met the woman who was her birth daughter, who was surrendered, she looked exactly like the pictures of Rose, much more so than his daughter, who I had met. And I think it was a shock. And the person who had the most difficult time in that meeting was the daughter, the first child, the other child of Rose, who never knew that she wasn't the firstborn and that she wasn't the only daughter. And I think it was very, very hard on her. But I think that it was very good for everyone in the room. And in the middle of the meeting, the adoptee, Sheila, said to Sam, what would you be to me? And he said, I don't know, I guess I'd be like a stepfather. And she just burst into tears and said, I would have been very proud to have you for my father. And it was a very, very moving and touching moment. And I think it was a real important completion, and it was a lovely gesture that Sam did that for Rose, and that he was able to make some completion in the family. He did give them some pictures, and he did have the opportunity to get to know this family in another way. And one of the very interesting things, and I think this is important because I want to give you the sense of the ongoing process of adoption, the systemic issues, how things connect and how they go on and on. And one of the interesting things is that girl who made that first phone call, the granddaughter of Rose, was not doing it for completely wonderful, fluffy reasons. Because what it turned out she wanted to say to Rose was that she was a single mother, that she had a 2-year-old, that she had not gotten married, and she kept her baby, unlike her grandmother who didn't keep her mother. And she had a message for Rose about that. And I think that it was really important for her to fix something that had been done wrong a few generations before, and her work was to fix it. And so the children of adoptees and the children of birth parents, I mean, it goes on into the next generation and the next. And if you do genograms, if you're involved in family systems therapy and you do a genogram a few generations back in each family, you can always see the threads and connections. And it's so important. If you don't know what's happening, you can't choose to change it. And there are so many opportunities to make changes when you know something, and there are so many opportunities to make errors when you don't. And so I think that this was a real important piece, and I like to tell that story because it does highlight a lot of things. One other funny little ending to that story is that Sam has 2 other sons, and they live far away. And he said, I'm not going to tell the other boys about this because they don't need to know. And I just said, Sam, the grave spews up secrets. You are 85, and I think you're going to have to do something. He said, okay, I'm going to take a vacation for 6 months, and then I'll come back and see you and bring them in. So that's the deal. And the 6 months is almost up. Sam's going to be getting a little dental card, your 6-month checkup. But I think that, you know, it is important to deal with those issues. I mean, they really can get you if you don't get them. And I think it's something that can really work out. I'm not going to spend too much more time on the birth parents, although they deserve a lot more time. And I'm also going to spend very little time on the adoptive parents. I'm just painting a little brushstroke picture to give you a sense of how important the whole system is in the best interest of the child. As you could tell from those stories and from others that you may personally know, there's a lot of loss involved in what happens for the birth parents. There is a real disconnection. Someone is missing in action. There's no way to grieve this loss. It's when a baby dies, the whole family gathers around. There's a service. There's some kind of way to grieve a loss. When a child is surrendered for adoption, there isn't a lot of positive feeling from society, and there isn't a lot of help that birth mothers get with that, and birth fathers even less so. And I think that it's extremely important to understand how that can lead into some problems later for people. Many of the birth parents that we deal with have levels of depression that I think are misdiagnosed and mistreated by the medical profession and by the helping professions, because it's unresolved grief and loss, and it's not something that needs heavy medication. It's something that needs a lot of attention, a lot of work. And I think that clinicians really need to be aware of that, and it's really in the best interest, again, of everyone to have some of those things handled, to have some of those things dealt with. Now, I'll quickly shift to the adoptive parents, and again, I'm not giving anyone enough airtime here, so but I feel it's important to give some sense. The adoptive parents that we work with, pre-adoptive couples that we work with, we spend a lot of time working with them around the issues of infertility, because in many of the cases, the young couples, and I'm talking about in the bulk of the cases that we work with, there are certainly other cases where that's not the case. There are secondary infertility situations also where people are coming, and sometimes that's sort of, oh, you already have a birth child. But the issues of infertility are very real for anyone. And I think that it's a very painful process to deal with the loss of all of your future children. Again, the loss of children is a huge issue. And I think that the cutoff of the future is a very painful feeling. To not be able to think of the generations that will follow you is an extremely painful idea. And couples have a very difficult time dealing with what they have to go through, not only with their emotions, but what they're put through in the process by the system. The medical invasive techniques, the medications, the things that people have to go through are pretty incredible and pretty painful. And then if the decision is to adopt, the process of adoption is a very painful and difficult one also. But I think that one of the mistakes that was made in the distant past was to try to make everything better. Try not to make it painful, pretend as if none of this ever happened, and get on with whatever in a way that just makes everyone happy. And so in the past, it was, sort of, oh, well, you're just going to adopt and everything will be all right. I think one of the things that we try very hard to work with adoptive parents to understand is that adoption does not fix infertility. And that's something that people don't get. It really takes a lot to understand that it does not fix infertility. Infertility is an ongoing problem, and adoption fixes parenting. It does not fix infertility. And I think people need to know that. They really need to understand it on a very deep level. It's also true in the couples that we work with that often one member of the couple is more ready to think of the next step than the other. And it's real important in family systems perspective to work with everyone to get people together enough to work as a family and as a couple. And I think that that's also very, very important. Some of the other things that we do with these couples is to work with them about explaining and educating them about the lifelong issues of adoption, because you're not just adopting a baby. Babies turn into 10, 15, 20, 30, 60-year-old people. And they go on and on and on, and the issues go on and on and on. And I think that these pre-adoptive couples need to have the opportunity to understand what it is that's going to happen in their family, and that it's different. It is definitely different. And it has been proven. David Kirk was one of the first in the 60s to show that the acknowledgement of difference is one of the key factors in a healthy adoptive family. So to be able to acknowledge the differences. And when I get to the children and talk about the adolescents, I'll also show how important it is for that to go both ways. I think that the kids also have to be able to acknowledge difference and to accept the differences in the adoptive parents and in the birth parents in order to feel good about themselves as well. The other thing that we work very hard with is the decision about adoption. In the past, I think that people have gone through many stages and will go through many more, and I probably won't have the same things to say in 5 years that I'm saying now, because I'll have learned even more. But I think that the importance of really hearing what people can handle and what they need is essential. I think this is more true in the cases where we're placing sibling sets, older children, handicapped children. Really, families have got to be able to know, to some extent, that they can handle what they're doing and that it's going to work out in everyone's best interest. With the pre-adoptive couples that we work with, when people are thinking about international adoptions or biracial infant adoptions, we work very hard to have these people confront their own racism. It's extremely important to understand that any child you're adopting is from another culture. Even one of the same, ethnic and religious background as you is from another culture because they're from another family. But the more different the culture, the more important it is to really confront that and see whether or not you can have a positive identity image to give to that child about that culture, and what else you can give to that child that won't be there if they don't have the resources available. And I will tell some stories later about some of the kids that we've worked with who have really difficult times acclimating themselves, especially in their adolescent years, without the kinds of support they need to understand where they come from. I'm not going to spend too much more time, although again, it deserves a lot more time. I'm going to get right to the children because I think that's the point of this talk. The families that we see with very little children, soon after the adoption, people are in a honeymoon period and they're all happy and snuggled up at home with their babies. And we don't see anybody in a clinic around those issues. The one exception to that, which is a very sad one and one that I think we may be seeing more of, is that we've had a couple of cases, and I will tell this one story. We had a family that had adopted a 4-year-old. I mean, she had been an infant. She was now 4. And they had adopted a second infant who was now 6 months old. The adoption was final, and the child was in their home, and they were very happy. And they learned that this child was HIV positive. And they had to confront their feelings of fear of loss, of whether or not this child would, how long would this child live, what would happen, could they keep this child in the family, their fear of catching AIDS, of having the other child catch AIDS. And they were trying to decide whether or not to return this baby to the agency or whether they could keep the child. Again, we had family therapy sessions. I saw the couple, and then I saw the whole family a few times. And one of the things that was very important for these people to understand, and something that people need help to understand, is the message to a 4-year-old, if you return a baby, is, if I get sick, will I be returned too? The issues that can come up for a child when they watch something like that are very, very powerful. And I think that the family needed to know that, and needed to know that this was a no-win situation, that if they kept this child, it was going to be very painful and very sad. And if they surrendered this child, it was going to be very painful and very sad. And they were able to make the decision to keep the child, and they've learned a lot about HIV-positive babies, and they have become very politically involved, and they're doing as well as they can. And I think that it's been an important process for them, but a very painful one. And as I said, that's the exception. We don't often see families with a 6-month-old in the clinic, but there was the exception. The usual course of action is that we begin to see families when children are between 2 and 5, and the parents are trying to think about how to tell them they're adopted. Now, for some people, this is a crisis, and for some, it isn't. You just tell. But for some families, it brings up issues. And for most couples, it brings up, again, the issues of infertility. Because often the child will come home from daycare one day and say, the teacher is pregnant, is having a baby, she's growing a baby in her tummy. Did I grow in your tummy? And it's very sad for the adoptive mother who did not grow that baby in her tummy to have that question asked. And children are very sensitive and pick up on the emotional messages and feelings from parents. And so sometimes the children will then decide not to ask those kinds of questions anymore and will shut down. And so it's very important for parents to get a lot of help in advance if they feel they will need it in order to know how to respond to those kinds of questions. A story I like to tell is a sort of funny one, is that one of the families I was working with, and this has happened with a couple of families, they were getting ready to tell their 4-year-old daughter that she was adopted, and they were really nervous about it. I had done a lot of couple sessions because it really was about their infertility again, and about their fear, and about not wanting to disappoint her, and how do you tell a child something like this. Well, one of the things that we do is to really get people to understand that a 4-year-old is a very concrete thinker and can only understand so much. And that isn't the time that you have to tell the entire story of their life and times. I always say that, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard and MIT are located. And I shop in the Star Market, and I'm always amazed at, I'm doing my little shopping, and there's this father with a 3-year-old in the shopping cart, and the child asks some simple question, and the father gives some dissertation of an answer. And the child is like totally engaged and loves his father, so is responding appropriately. It's a bright child. But that child does not know anything about nuclear physics, let's face it. And you know that they don't, but they look like they're very precocious, and they probably are to some extent. And it's just amazing to me. And I think in nervousness or in other ways, parents sometimes go on and on and on. And really, if you stop and check with the child about what they really understood about that, you'd be amazed at their interpretation. So I really work with parents to just make it simple. The truth and simplicity is really what's real important for kids, just to begin to build on the truth. And so anyway, this family came to see me several times, and then they called and said they were bringing Jenny in on Tuesday night because they had already told her that they had made the word adoption familiar, and they wanted her to come in and talk to me about it. And so I said, fine. So I opened my office door on Tuesday night at 6 o'clock, and Jenny bounced in with her pigtails flipping in the breeze and said, guess what, Joyce? I'm a doctor. So all their work in trying to tell Jenny that she was adopted, that's how she understood it. They just stood there and looked completely pale and horrified. And we sat down and we started talking about doctors and adopted. And yes, I'm a doctor, and I'm adopted, but you're not a doctor yet. You're just a doctor. So we got this whole conversation going, and Jenny began to understand a little better. I like to talk to people about books on adoption, and I think that for children there aren't very many good books, so if any of you are potential children's book writers, please do it. The only book that I feel totally comfortable with for very little kids is the Gordon and Susan Adopt a Baby book for Sesame Street, which is ridiculous. It has nothing to do with anything about adoption. It just says the word. It's really about sibling rivalry. But it's simple and it makes the word familiar. And I think that's, excuse me? It's called, Gordon and Susan's out of print? Oh, that's terrible. We'll have to get it back in print. Okay, well, we'll all have to gather around and get them to reprint it because it's a wonderful, simple book. And really and I think that you need to give parents a tool that's the most simple so that they can feel most comfortable filling in whatever they need to at that point in time. And some of the other books are very good, but are for slightly older children. I mean, they bring up too much or bring in too much. And I think that it gets more complicated. And the parents need to feel empowered because it's very important that the children have an okay sense about all of this. The most important thing is that you don't want to have the teachers or the people at school or other people bringing this up in ways that are, negative. Many of the adult adoptees I see in therapy, their memory of how they were told they were adopted is, one of the worst and most painful parts of their adoption. Not just the fact that they were adopted, but the ways they were told or the ways it was brought out by people. I'm gonna speed through this, and then I'm gonna take lots of questions from you. So I hope you'll write down little notes and remember things as we go along. The school-aged adopted children have lots of trouble. The statistics are very high for adopted kids ending up in programs for learning disabled and for kids with emotional problems. The statistics are very, very high. And people have different theories about that. People really think that, perhaps the birth parents, did something during the pregnancy, or perhaps there's some genetic cause, or perhaps, in a small portion of cases, maybe some of those things are true. But in a very large portion of cases, it's, I believe, really the complexity of making sense of adoption. That a small child getting this information and trying to make sense of it, for an adult, it's very complicated. If you didn't know anything about adoption and you tried to explain it to the person next to you, think of how complicated it is. What do you mean you had another set of parents? What do you mean? Wait a minute, you mean there are these other people? As you explain it, it's very, very complicated. And if you think about that, with all your conceptual talents, it's one thing. But for a 3-, 4-, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, to begin to take that in to understand it. And when they hear it between 3 and 5, they're still in fantasy land. Children between 3 and 5 are still having a hard time deciding what's fantasy and what's reality. And so it's very important to continue the discussion as they get into the next cognitive stage so that they can process it at that stage also. And you'd have no idea how any child is going to make sense of anything, how anyone is going to make sense of anything. You're all sitting here listening to me, one person, speak. If I were to go around and ask what I've said in the last 5 minutes, I would hear many different versions because you're processing it through your lens. You have a whole way of seeing this and a whole way of thinking about what I'm saying, and you're processing it with your thoughts. And so each child has their own makeup and their own way of processing things. And some kids, when they're very little, just take it, oh, it's, you know, like Jenny, guess what? I'm a doctor. Oh, I'm adopted? Okay, guess what? I mean, she just bounced in and took it for granted at that age. There's another little boy that I worked with who was 5 years old, and he was having lots of problems in school, lots of disruptions, lots of problems at home at nighttime, going to sleep. His parents had adopted another child, and he had watched that adoption take place, so he understood more about it from the perspective of a viewer rather than from the subjective stance. And he was thinking a lot about all of this. He was making sense of it, and he was having trouble with it. And one night, as he was going to sleep, his mother said, "Why are you so sad? What's the matter?" And he said, "You know how you get really worried when you can't find me in the store or when you can't see me in the backyard playing, and you get really upset and then you get angry?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "My other mother must be very upset and very angry, and I'm really worried about her." And that was how he had made sense of this information. He was a very sensitive, very smart little boy, and he got it. This is a very scary thing, that I can't see her and that she can't see me. And his adoptive parents wanted to open the adoption right then and there. They got completely, they had never thought of an open adoption, but they came into the office and said, "What can we do?" And they're in the process of working with a very traditional Boston agency that doesn't do open adoptions now, let alone 90 years ago. And they're having a very hard time getting any kind of response, but they're working on it, and they're really trying to do something to get more information because they feel that that really is in the best interest of this child. And that's with the family support and with it coming from them, I think it's extremely important. The children that we work with do have a hard time making sense of this, and it does get in the way of schoolwork. I've always said, and I thought I was going to get myself into a lot of trouble. I was speaking at Mass General Hospital, which is a Harvard teaching hospital, a few years ago, to a bunch of Druid psychiatrists. They all had white hair, and they were all there for their CMUs. And I thought, oh, these guys, first of all, I'm going to talk about family systems theory, and they're not going to like that. It's not psychoanalytic. We're in Boston. Second of all, I'm going to talk about all these adoption things, and they're going to hate this. And then I'm going to talk about attention deficit disorder, which is the favorite diagnosis of every pediatrician and psychiatrist in the whole country for kids, especially adopted kids. And I like to go on my rampage about how, as an adoptee, I can say this. I think that all adoptees have ADD, but we used to call it daydreaming. And these are kids who are very preoccupied, who are trying to make sense of very complex ideas about something very primal. And why wouldn't they be distracted? I think it would be very weird if they weren't. So I gave my little spiel and waited for the tomatoes to be thrown. And nothing happened. They listened intently. And after that conference, 12 of the Druids invited me into the walnut-lined library. And I thought, okay, now they're going to get me alone. I see this coming. So I get into the library, and I'm waiting to hear what they're going to say. And 5 of the 12 were adoptive fathers. And what they had to say was that they had learned a lot that they had never known, that they had they had children who are now adults who were adopted, and they had seen clients for many, many years, and that they had never thought about it in this context, and that they really wanted to know more. And 2 of those psychiatrists have come to some of our trainings to learn more. And I think that, and I've been invited, I train the residents and interns every year at Mass General now in family therapy and adoption. I do a little training. So I think that there is, some movement to accept this information and to begin to understand how important it is to think about these things in a different context. So these kids who are having ADD, now, and there really is a diagnosis such as ADD, and there really is a drug called Ritalin that does work very well with that. And I think that it's important to be very careful in making a diagnosis because not everyone doesn't have it either, and it could be very helpful to identify it. But I think it's a sweeping generalization that all of these kids could have that particular diagnosis and that all of these kids could need drugs. I think the message is not a good one, and it concerns me. And so I really like to have people be aware of looking closely at what's going on with these children. I've learned a lot from the kids that I work with in therapy, and I'm going to tell you a few of their stories. One of the little boys that I worked with was a 10-year-old, and his case was a little more complex. He had been in 2 foster homes before he was placed for adoption, so he had lots of losses in his life. And he was doing very poorly in school. He was in every resource room. He was, getting all kinds of help. And I met with the family, and then I saw him individually a few times. And in the sessions alone with him, I was amazed at how insightful and bright he was as we were talking. And I thought, well, what's really going on here? So I did a little bit of evaluation, and I took out my little blocks and tried to do some math with him. I was trying to assess some of his problems. And we were doing the blocks, and he burst into tears. And he said, I can't do subtraction because when they say take away, it makes me too sad. And it was a very profound experience for me to get something like that so clearly. This little boy had stopped learning in 2nd grade as soon as they said take away 2. No more was he going to listen to that stuff. He had so much loss and undealt with loss that he just couldn't deal with loss in school. And it took a lot of work and a lot of intensive therapy with him and a lot of work with his whole family to support him and a lot of work with the school system. That's why I really believe in systems therapy. You can't fix this little boy all by himself. This is a big problem, and it was created by society, and it needs to be fixed on a larger level. So you've got to bring in all of the pieces and get them working together, and that's really the best way to change things. And it was amazing how this kid improved. It was amazing how he was able to do work after he was able to resolve a lot of this loss and a lot of this grief. And I think that that's extremely important. I think that some of the other ways, there's an assignment in school for the family tree that kids get somewhere between the 6th and the 9th grade. And it's a difficult assignment for a lot of kids, and people don't really realize what it brings up for these children. It's a lie if you do your adoptive family sometimes and you feel like you'll get an F because you're cheating. Or if, what do you do? How do you do this assignment? How do you make sense of it? I'm going to take questions afterwards. So I think that, kids are worried about, will that be right? Will that be wrong? Will I be cheating if I do that? Will I hurt someone's feelings if I put other information down? And if I'm in a foster home, will I be embarrassed to tell some other kids in the class that? I don't want them to know. If my parents are divorced, it brings up lots of issues for lots of kids, not just adopted kids. And years ago, I developed a curriculum at Wheelock College called the Family Orchard. And it's a wonderful thing because my daughter had the assignment of doing the family tree, and I was on the board of her private school, so I had a little clout. And I went in to the teacher and asked if I could come in and do a preface before the assignment. And she said, sure, Joyce, come on in. So I came in and I did this thing about how some kids had trees, but most people had orchards, and they had a lot of different families, and that it would be really important to be able to put down something about all of your families. And so it was a wonderful process for these kids who had, a lot of the kids were in divorced families, step families, had half brothers and step brothers and half sisters, and it just made things possible without being complicated. You could put each tree and then show how they matched with each other. It was an interesting process and a useful one, and when they invited me back on the day that the kids presented their orchards. And it was interesting because the one girl in the room who didn't have an orchard, you could tell her parents helped her with the assignment. She had the family Bible from 1620. Her, family had come over on the Mayflower, and she had the perfect family tree. And she was sort of depressed because hers was boring. So, I figured that probably won't hurt her in life. And it was, it's hard to see a kid be sad, but it was, probably not going to kill her to have this experience. And it was really wonderful for the other kids to be able to share so much about their lives in a way that was positive. So I think that we need to work with the school systems. We need to work with families. We need to, in the best interest of the child, you've got to have a lot of cooperation.
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.